guide, our instructor, will be Kurt Sampson. He's an archaeologist, director of the effigy Mounds initiative, board member of the Wisconsin Archaeological Society, and director and curator of the Dodge County Historical Society. So you can ask questions on the social media post. You can post questions in there. Kurt may answer those as we go along. Otherwise, at the end of the discussion, we'll have a chance for some more questions and things. So with no further ado, I'll leave you to Kurt.
Well, thank you, Joe. Thanks for having me. Thanks for this Cedarburg History Museum for putting this all together and giving me the opportunity to present to all of you some of the research that we're doing on the mounds that used to exist in the Hilgen Springs resort in Cedarburg. I want to give you a little bit of background just to start off. The Hilgen Springs mound site was located in what was called the Hilgen Springs Resort in Cedarburg, Wisconsin. And some of you that might be chiming in that are from that area will know that area as the area over by Cedar's Bowling Alley and upslope of the hill there where the water treatment plant is. And initially, the Hilgen Springs Resort, which was founded in 1852 by Frederick Hilgen, who's one of the founding fathers of Cedarburg, developed a spring resort there. And on that property, still even today, there are natural springs. And coincidentally, natural springs are also considered sacred to many Native American groups, especially up in the Upper Great Lakes, which will kind of tie into our discussion tonight a little bit. But back in the 1800s, especially in the latter half of the 1800s, 1880s through the Victorian era through the 1920s, it was very fashionable around the state of Wisconsin to develop these spring resort parks, which were based on the people coming from all around the country and the world to reap the benefits, if you will, of the springs and the spring water. Cedarburg, in a sense, was almost partially founded on this spring resort. And even in Beaver Dam, where the Dodge County Historical Society is, we had a spring resort, which was called the Swan Spring Resort. And so these were quite popular. And the Hilgen Spring Resort lasted from 1852 all the way up until 1941. And during that stretch of 89 years that was a spring resort, the Indian mounds that were on the property there were actually looked upon as kind of a curiosity to the people that came from all around the country to recreate at the park. I want to tell you a little bit about how this project came about. Before I went to the Dodge County Historical Society as the director of the museum there, which was back in mid 2008, before that, I was working at the Milwaukee Public Museum in the anthropology department under the direction of my old boss, Don Schertzme. And my job at the time was to recurate or curate archaeological collections that mostly focused on mound site excavations that had occurred through the Milwaukee Public Museum through the course of about 100 years or so. And Dawn Schertzme, who's the head curator of anthropology, she knew that I was from Cedarburg, Wisconsin initially. And so naturally, she asked me if I was interested in recataloging the excavated materials that came from the Hilgen Springs mound site excavation. Now, the Hilgen Springs mound site excavation occurred in 1968, and it was done by a well-known avocational archaeologist named Howard Van Langdon. And back in 1968, they wanted to build that water treatment plant on the hill there by Cedars, just below the cemetery there. And in 1968, the state of Wisconsin did not have a Burial Sites Protection Act at that time, Wisconsin didn't actually get a Burial Sites Protection Act until about 1985, and that was signed into law by Governor Tommy Thompson. So prior to 1985, mound sites were still being excavated to some degree by archaeologists and also by lay people that were interested in finding out more information about the mounds. And as a result of that, these mounds were going to be destroyed by the development of the water treatment plant in Cedarburg. There was no law in place at that time that would protect them from being destroyed. And unfortunately, quite frankly, it was very it was unfortunate that the city leaders of Cedarburg at that time didn't have a little bit more foresight to think to preserve these mounds for posterity, because this mound site, as it turns out, ended up being one of the oldest conical burial mound sites in the entire upper Midwest. So when I started to recatalog the artifacts and human remains and things that were excavated by Howard Van Langdon, J. Van Langdon, one of his sons back in 1968, who's still alive today, he provided me back around 2006 with some excavation photographs that had never been seen before of the excavations of the mound site. And for whatever reason, when Howard Van Langdon wrote his archaeological report of the Hilgen Springs mound site back in 1971, for whatever reason, he didn't include nearly 150 spectacular artifact or excavation photographs in this report. And so back in 2006, when I first started working on the Hilgen Springs materials, I knew that J. Van Langdon was still alive and that he had lived in the Mequon and Grafton area, and that he also was at the excavations as a young boy of about 10 or 12 years old in 1968. So I called him, asking him with the hopes of seeing what he might remember about being on the excavation. And that's when he informed me that he had these excavation photographs and that he would be willing to let me have them so I could examine them and examine the archaeological context of this site a little bit deeper. Joel, if you could go to the next slide, please. Joel for the Cedarburg History Museum is helping us out tonight by advancing the slides because I'm not able to do that on my end. I want to tell you a little bit about, real quickly, about how I got involved with archaeology and mounds. Growing up in Cedarburg, most of my life, especially in elementary school and middle school, we used to take field trips from Thorson, where I went to elementary school, to Lizard Mound County Park in Washington County, just near West Bend, Wisconsin. And Lizard Mound County Park, which is now a state park, is a park that preserves about 36 effigy mounds that date to the late Woodland period. And at that time, around third, fourth, fifth grade, that usually in fifth grade is when kids start learning about social studies and Wisconsin history. And so our teacher at the time took us to the effigy mound site to teach us about Native American history. And unfortunately, back in 1960, the Milwaukee Public Museum had done some excavations at Lizard Mound with the expressed purpose of trying to uncover an intact burial within an effigy mound. And then they got the bright idea of somebody putting a cement retaining wall around it and putting a piece of plexiglass over the top of that. And that's what you're seeing on this slide right here. And when I was in third, fourth, and fifth grade, and we went on field trips there, I remember seeing this display. And of course, being, at an impressionable age at that time, it really struck me at the time. And of course, our teacher at the time was trying to make a moral argument about whether this was something that was appropriate. And using the argument of, how would you like it if somebody dug up your grandmother and put a piece of plexiglass over her? Well, that really struck home with me. But unfortunately, this exhibit was on display until the late 1970s, and somebody actually broke into the display and stole the bones. And somehow the Washington County Sheriff's Department figured out who that was. And then finally, after that episode, they decided that this probably wasn't a good idea. But at that time, even though I didn't realize it, as a young man at that time, young boy at the time, it did directly have an influence on me later in life, studying history and archaeology in college later. Joel, if you go to the next slide, please. So over the last 40 plus years, I've been studying woodland period mound building cultures as kind of a hobby, and then eventually as a profession, as a professional archaeologist. And this slide here just kind of shows an artist's rendition of some Native American people, not only building a conical mound, but also building an effigy mound. And these are artistic impressions that are actually at Effigy Mounds National Monument, which is just across the river from Prairie du Chien on the Iowa side of the river, just north of Marquette, Iowa. So if you ever get a chance to go down to that area, it's one of the few national parks that are fairly close to Wisconsin other than the Apostle Islands. But over the course of the last 40 years, I've been to over 700 different mound sites around Wisconsin and the upper Midwest and all over the eastern seaboard, and learning about how these different mound building cultures came to be and what the differences between them were. Joel, if you could go to the next slide, please. So to begin with, what we're going to do is we're going to have a little bit of background information about what these woodland periods mean and what exactly is a burial mound or a conical mound. And I'll start off by saying that the burial of relatively few people in pits below mounds reflects the growing complexity of Native American societies in Eastern North America around 1000 BC, in which differences in social status were becoming evident in the archaeological record. So right around 1000 BC, between about 1000 BC to 800 BC, over 2,500 years ago, is when people started building burial mounds for the first time in Wisconsin and in the upper Great Lakes area. Next slide, please. These are just a few Wisconsin Indian mound facts that we'll start off with, based on some research and work done by Amy Roseborough. Dr. Roseborough is an archaeologist and a friend who is the Assistant State Archaeologist of Wisconsin. And in 2010, she produced her PhD dissertation at the University of Wisconsin on effigy mound culture, or what we refer to now as the effigy mound ceremonial complex. And in the Wisconsin Historical Society, in the Office of the State Archaeologist, they maintain an archaeological sites inventory, which maintains all the known historic and prehistoric sites in the state of Wisconsin. And to this day, there are roughly 2,500 conical or dome-shaped mounds that still exist in Wisconsin. Roughly 2,600 effigy mounds that are in the shape of animals that we'll talk a little bit about, and roughly 3,200 mound groups that still remain across the state. Every year, new mound sites are being discovered and reported. Some of these are in areas on private properties that are remote or inaccessible, and with the use of LiDAR technology today, we're able to discern and find more overlooked mound sites on the landscape that haven't been destroyed from cultivation or whatnot. And so most of the mounds, like I mentioned, were built between roughly about 500 BC to about AD 1200 to 1300. And at one time, there was approximately 25,000 burial mounds in the state of Wisconsin, We'll never know the exact number of mounds due to their destruction as early as even the 1820s in the state of Wisconsin. Next slide, please. Now, talking about the mound site and putting the Hilgen Springs mound site into context, we're going to be talking about the early woodland period, which is highlighted in red on this slide, from about 1000 BC to about 2000 BC. Now, the woodland tradition in Wisconsin, these are archaeological terms that help us frame the mound construction or burial mound construction periods in the prehistoric record in Wisconsin. But the entire woodland tradition, from 1000 BC all the way up to about 1200 AD, is framed entirely by the initial use of pottery, which in early woodland times we call Marian thick, the beginning of burial mounds and the elaborate rituals that went into their construction, which we'll talk about more today. And also the beginning of plant cultivation with less mobility that starts to show up in the archaeological record. And at this point, there's still a basic archaic lifeway still mostly present of hunters and gatherers making subsistence rounds around the state. But where that blue arrow there on the screen points to, that's the time frame that we're going to be talking about, the early woodland period. And that is framed in the context of when the mounds at Hilgen Spring Park were constructed in Cedarburg. Okay, next slide, please. So setting the stage for early conical mound construction. Now, when I use the term conical, I mean dome-shaped mounds, and I'll show you some examples of those other than the Hilgen Spring ones. But we're going to talk a little bit about the late archaic transformation to this early woodland period, which really begins about 4000 BC and lasts all the way through that early woodland period. This is a time where the earliest cemeteries in Wisconsin first start to appear in the archaeological record during the long transitional period from the mid-archaic to the early woodland between 4000 to 1500 BC. And then, like I mentioned before, sometime right around 1000 to 800, going into about 500 BC, the first humanly constructed burial mounds appear on the Wisconsin landscape. The appearance of these burial mounds, suggests some important social changes were taking place in North America. At this time, people were semi-sedentary on the landscape and had base camp settlements around. They were using caches of mortuary lithic blades that we see in the archaeological record, and also the use of red ochre. Red ochre is iron hematite that occurs naturally in the geological record in Wisconsin, and they were using this and grinding it. They were grinding it down from its pebble form into a fine red powder, and they were incorporating this into burial ritualism and spreading it on top of burials that not only burials that were in the flesh, but burials that were cremation style burials at this time. At this time, also, the modern environment around 4000 BC begins to stabilize and establish itself. We are still, believe it or not, coming out of the last glacial period of the Pleistocene in Wisconsin, which was actually called the Wisconsin Glaciation. And right now we are in the what's called the Holocene. And at that time, the late archaic, the environment as we know it today is beginning to become more stable. This period is known also almost exclusively from rock shelter excavations that occurred in the Driftless area of Wisconsin by archaeologists like Warren Witchery back in the 1950s, and from surface collected artifacts that were plowed up in farm fields with examples of things like Durst and Preston rock shelters in southwestern Wisconsin. And I'll show you some examples of what I mean by that as we go farther along. And also the period is highlighted by the use of certain types of diagnostic artifacts like Preston notched and Durst projectile points, which are widespread in use at this time. Certain types of pipestone and soapstones were common commonly used to make Native American pipes. And as I also mentioned before, by 500 BC, Wisconsin's first pottery, called Marion Thick, is seen in the archaeological record, coinciding with the first burial mounds, which are these conical mounds. And these Marion Thick pottery is made of clays, natural occurring clays with crushed rock, which were typical of the pottery of the early woodland period. Okay, Joel, if you could go on to the next slide, please. This is an example of some of the pottery types that we find in the early woodland in Wisconsin. And pottery is the best datable archaeological evidence because the pottery shapes and how they're made with their temper, and if they have certain motifs on their outer exterior, we have a pretty good chronology in Wisconsin of the pottery types that occur throughout the woodland traditions that help us date a site. And these are examples of the types of pottery that were found at the Hilgen Springs Mound site. And coincidentally, though, Marion Thick pottery is actually fairly rare in southeastern Wisconsin, even though it's found at Hilgen Springs. But and then there is some use of chevron lines that are, if you look to at the pot on the left-hand side, you'll see vertical and horizontal lines, and those have been interpreted to have possible upper and lower world connotations in Native American belief systems, which we'll also talk about a little bit about in a little bit here. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so in the late Archaic period, before they're making mounds, and before the development of conical burial mounds, we have this culture in archaeology, or a complex that we call the red ochre complex. And red ochre is the name that archaeologists use to refer to the ceremonial burial complex that was found throughout much of the Great Lakes in the Midwest region that dated to about 1200 BC up to 500 BC, right around the time when they start building the first conical mounds. The red ochre complex includes a series of different differing regional cultures that shared certain elaborate burial customs through the exchange of exotic lithic materials. Lithic means stone materials that they were using to make stone tools with. Things such as ceremonial chip stone blades, like you see in these two small pictures here. Also, they use this for very distinctive diagnostic time period projectile points like turkey tails, Adena points, and large ovate blades. Red ochre burials at this time were often placed on top of naturally occurring knolls like glacial cames, and were not humanly constructed mounds at first. But this may have been what inspired them to eventually make conical burial mounds by basket loads of dirt. So they're putting their burials in the ground on top of naturally occurring knolls that occur in a glaciated landscape of Wisconsin. And then eventually that might have been the impetus for them to build humanly constructed conical burial mounds. But in any event, burials were an important link to the people, to the land and their ancestral territories. And flexed, which means placed in the fetal position, bundle burials and cremations were common in these naturally occurring knoll burials. And in Wisconsin, there are 30 plus identified red ochre ceremonial burial sites in the state. That's not a lot. Excuse me, that's not a lot. So in hindsight, we really don't know a lot about the early woodland period. Next slide, please. This is just an artist's rendition of late Archaic Native Americans placing a burial in the ground, and the use of ground hematite into red ochre to as a some type of ceremonial inclusion into the burial itself. I'll explain what that means a little bit more as we get farther into the presentation here. Next slide, please. Just to highlight really quickly some of the burial types, we have A, which is an extended in the flesh burial. Flex burial, like we just mentioned, is when people are placed in the fetal position, but in the flesh. A bundle burial is letter D, flex burial C, and a cremation burial. A bundle burial is interesting because what that basically means is that a person died, and let's say it was the winter, and they couldn't dig the ground. So what they would do is one of a couple things. They would either place you on a scaffolding, like you see oftentimes in the American West, like with the Sioux culture, where they placed burials on scaffolding and let your flesh decay off your bones, and then they would go back and collect whatever bones remained with your skull and your leg bones, and they would bundle those up in a nice tight deerskin bag of some type, or some type of natural bag, and then they would transport your remains to the mound site to be buried. So these are just examples of different types of burials that occur in woodland tradition burials throughout the woodland tradition. Next slide, please. The location of red ochre burial ceremonial sites and early woodland sites in Wisconsin. You can see in the circle there with the arrow in Ozaukee County, the approximate location of the Hilgen Springs Mound site near Cedarburg. And these are other sites around the state that have exhibited red ochre burial ceremonialism. And some of them also have mound sites on them as well, like the Henschel site in Sheboygan County and the Outlet Mound, which we'll talk a little bit about. But these are all sites that exhibited either red ochre ceremonialism or sites that were connected to early woodland mound site construction. Next slide, please. This is not a complete map of early and middle woodland mound sites, but you can see that there are not many. And you see that they cluster towards the Mississippi, along the upper Mississippi Riverway in the southeast portion of the state, where the Mississippi and the Wisconsin River converge. And coincidentally, that is also in the area where the Effigy Mounds National Monument is. There surely were more early and middle woodland conical mounds that were not recognized before their destruction in state. But we can only go on with what we have left. Next slide, please. Now, one thing I want to just highlight really briefly is in the late 1800s, 1880s, 1890s, there was still a lot of racism towards Native Americans at that time. And by that time, there had been a pretty much a systematic genocide of Native American culture across the board in North America. And at that time, even going into the 1880s and 1890s, there was still some question in some people's minds about who actually constructed the millions of burial mounds that were seen across the eastern seaboard all the way out to the Great Lakes and along the Mississippi Delta going up through the Great Lakes. And the Bureau of Ethnology, which was later became the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they decided through an act of Congress that they wanted to do a mound site exploration through the Bureau of Ethnology, which was headed up by Cyrus Thomas, and at the time, what was called the Museum Men. And what this was Congress went to the Bureau of Ethnology, and they basically said, we want you to go around the entire country and systematically excavate as many of these Native American burial mounds as you can, with the sole goal of once and for all figuring out who constructed these mounds. And back throughout the early parts of the 1800s, there was a lot of speculation about who built the mounds. A lot of people thought, well, they couldn't have been built by the ancestors of the Native Americans, but in fact they were. But that's where you get all these crazy ideas that the Phoenicians or the Egyptians and many other ancient groups of the old world were responsible for building the mounds. Well, after doing this systematic excavation with the museum men, And then Cyrus Thomas writing this massive report called the Mound Explorations of the Bureau of Ethnology, they once and for all determined that, yes, in fact, the mounds were built by the Native Americans. Through looking through this mound exploration book, when they were doing these systematic excavations, they were also including some fairly detailed maps of the stratigraphy and the profiles of the excavations of these conical burial mounds. And it's very obvious when you read through the mound exploration report that a lot of these mounds that they were excavating were early woodland mounds, but they didn't realize that at the time because they didn't have the luxury of having radiocarbon dating at that time in the 1890s. But so looking through this book as part of my research, we're looking for what are the traits of early woodland conical mounds in this region. Well, if you look at the Wisconsin Archaeologist Journal, there are 20 plus articles in there that describe red ochre related sites in Wisconsin, but none of those sites are actual burial mound sites except for Hilgen Springs and a few of these other red ochre sites that are near Cedarburg, in Cedarburg, Elm Grove, Thiensville, Milwaukee, Racine, and Waukesha. Next slide, please. So funerary activities and traits of early woodland conical mound construction. These are what we've learned from reading these reports that were done and what we've learned from the excavations of the Hilgen Springs site. They use a lot of artificial layers of ash, special soils, sand, red ochre, muck, hard clay, puddled clays, rock piles, or altars, as we call them archaeologically. And you'll see what I mean by those altars when I start showing you the excavation photographs of Hilgen Spring. And camp debris that were scraped up to form the construction of these basket loads of dirt to construct these mounds. Some aspects of red ochre burial ritualism survive the transitional mound building periods, mostly seen in the use of the red ochre, and then also in certain artifacts like gorgets and projectile points, which were placed purposefully in the burials with the mounds. And some of these features seem to reflect ritualism, which has been interpreted to well-known cosmological beliefs and Native American spiritual beliefs of regeneration, rebirth, and fertility, and the regeneration of the seasons and whatnot. And oftentimes these mounds are placed on high river terraces overlooking major bends in the river. And that's exactly what you see with the Hilgen Springs mounds on Cedar Creek, where they were placed up above Cedar Creek when they still existed. Next slide, please. Early woodland mounds tend to be wide in diameter, 40, 50 feet in diameter, and shorter in height than middle woodland conical burial mounds. And they tend to be a little bit smaller than mounds that come a little bit after them. The mound surface floors were often cleared before the burial construction began. Early woodland mounds have been left open for periods of time before capped off with ritual experience. Rectangular subsurface burial pits were common features in initial woodland period mounds, and they almost always contained extended in the flesh singular burials, sometimes multiple burials, which included cremation burials with an emphasis on cremations in early woodland, and also bundle burials. And Hilgen Spring and the three mounds that were at the Hilgen Spring site had all of those types of burials that you'll see. Initially, these burials were often built over areas of naturally occurring gravel pits with a small layer of dark organic soil or organic matter capping it off. And oftentimes, intrusive burials were later placed in later woodland period mounds. And this shows a continuation of using the sacred space. Next slide, please. From the Bureau of Ethnology report, these are some profile examples of more than likely early woodland conical mound constructions, which show the placement of rock altars in them, which we'll see at Hilgen Springs. And this mound on the bottom here also seems to exhibit early woodland conical mound construction that shows different layering of multiple burials in a mound with different layers of brought in organic sands and muck and marl. Next slide, please. Some other examples, conical mound examples from Illinois and Wisconsin. Internal mound features of rock piles, again. Singular sub-basin pit in the middle mound profile. And then again, a Dousman mound over by Prairie du Chien that shows, again, rock altars being placed in the mounds. And I'll explain what those rock altars possibly mean. Next slide, please. Now, effigy mounds are different. Effigy mounds are built in the late woodland period. And these are mounds that are shaped in the form of an animal in plain view on the ground. And those are constructed between about 500 to 600 AD up to about 1200 AD in the late woodland period. So they're different in construction than the conical burial mounds that we're going to talk about. And this is an example of an effigy of what they call an otter. That was by from the Coulterman Mound site in Dodge County in our neck of the woods up near Beaver Dam. And if you look, you can see there's a cremation burial in the center pot or center part of the mound there, where they excavated this down and they found a cremation burial. Effigy mounds typically contain flexed or bone bundles and cremations, but they differ from conical burial mounds because they typically do not usually include extended burials. And typically the burials occur in the heart region of the animal in effigy plain view. Okay, next slide, please. I just wanted to show you the difference here. Now, here are some examples of some middle woodland conical burial mounds versus early woodland. You can see that these mounds are quite large. And the middle woodland is right after the early woodland period, between 200 BC and AD 400, right after when the Hilgen Springs mound sites were built. And you can see these are very large conical burial mounds with multiple burial pit features in them that were built up over an extended period of time over multiple generations. And these mounds often contain elaborate grave goods with them. An example of the most famous one in Wisconsin is the Nichols Mound, which is over by Trempealeau, Wisconsin. Next slide, please. This is an example of the inner workings of the Nichols Mound, which is middle woodland. And it shows some of the artifacts that are in the collection of the Milwaukee Public Museum. And you see these in the upper right there, exotic lithic materials, stone pipes, obsidian from the western, from Yellowstone and Banff, and even copper beads and things from the upper Great Lakes. And this was a mound that was excavated in 1927 by an archaeologist named Will McKern. And it just gives you an example. Now, if you look at the diagram there of the mound, you can see the subsurface burial pit with the berm and the original topping, and then the mound being built up on top of that with artifacts being placed within the mound. Now, they're doing this to some extent in the early woodland conical mound construction as well. Next slide, please. This is just Nichols Mound, what it looked like on the natural landscape before it was excavated in 1927. You see the person standing off to the right there for size comparison. Next slide, please. Again, middle woodland construction. Sometimes in middle woodland mounds, they would build these stone crypts inside them, where they would have piles of rocks in a square crypt, if you will. And sometimes they would place logs over the tops of these burials. And you can see from the Dunleith mound here, from the Dunleith Mound site in northwestern Illinois, how they had multiple burials in a internal chamber. Now, this is also different than early woodland construction. This mostly occurred in middle woodland construction. Next slide, please. Coincidentally, in Grafton, just up the river from where the Hilgen Springs mound site was, we identified this conical burial mound along the Cedar Creek, like Hilgen Springs, on a high river terrace in Grafton. And if you know anything about cedar trees, that's actually a very old cedar tree that's growing on top of that conical mound. Cedar trees grow very slowly, and that's also gave us an indication that this was a conical burial mound that had been untouched by development, even though it's between two houses in Grafton. Next slide, please. And this is just a shot that I didn't actually take this photograph, but it shows you three conical burial mounds similar to the layout of how Hilgen Springs was in Cedarburg. These mounds are actually in Effigy Mounds National Monument, but it's the same concept of how the mounds would look in their naturally occurring state and what they would look like if you encountered them in the natural environment. Next slide, please. This is just a Charles Brown map of the Outlet Mound, which is a identified early woodland conical burial mound site that had multiple conical burial mounds on it. And if you go to the next slide, please, you will see the Outlet Mound site in Madison, which is preserved again in the middle of a mound or of a subdivision. And this mound, some of these mounds were excavated, and they exhibited the early woodland use of red ochre influence in these conical burials. Next mound slide, please. So why were mounds built here, or why were they built where they were built? Mound sites were chosen because of certain spiritual and supernatural attributes attributed to the natural terrain that they were built upon by their makers. Mound sites were viewed as sacred space and places where natural and supernatural worlds balance each other in world renewal. There was a common concern for harmony with the natural terrain. Mound sites are almost always built by natural springs, and this includes early, middle, and late woodland mound sites, especially effigy mound sites. And these were very important. Natural springs were considered sacred by many Native American groups and were considered doorways to the underworld, where spirits of both people and animals could go between the upper and lower world of this world and the world below, and could traverse those worlds, so to speak. Mound sites also expressed underlying social arrangements in the form of three-dimensional landscapes, and served as territorial markers and possibly zone buffers between groups. So you imagine coming up Cedar Creek 2,500 years ago in a dugout canoe, and you look upslope and you see three large conical burial mounds. Well, that tells other people that, yes, we are here. And these possibly served as not only sacred sites where people could recognize these sacred sites over multiple generations, but also as territorial markers to other groups of indigenous people that might have wandered into the territory. And we know that Wisconsin mound builders were semi-territorial peoples with a shared ritual complex. Mounds might have been also built for prestige seeking and communal labor projects for the group of people. And one other thing that we're studying right now is possible astronomical alignments of certain mound sites as solstice markers and celestial representation of star constellations and patterns in the night sky. And Hilgen Springs actually could possibly represent the Orion constellation. Next slide, please. Now, this is a map on the right-hand side that was done in 1903 1907 by Charles E. Brown that shows the layout of the Hilgen Springs mound site, which is flipped on its side a little bit. This is purely speculation on my part, but it does have the formation of the Orion constellation. And if you can imagine thousands of years ago, when there's no light pollution on the prehistoric landscape, people even 2,500 years ago had a very detailed knowledge of the celestial heavens and the movements of the stars, the moon, the sun, and we're keeping close track of these things. And later in mound constructions, they did express some of that knowledge in the construction of mounds. Next slide, please. Okay, so finally, we are at the point where we are ready to talk about the Hilgen Spring Mound site. All of you have gotten a little bit of background information now about the cultural time period we're talking about, the types of mound construction that we're talking about, and now we'll get into the what we know about the mounds at Hilgen Springs and Cedarburg. This is the earliest known photograph taken in December of 1904 by W.J. Boehm, and it was first published in the Wisconsin Archaeologist Journal in 1906. And if you look at the photo carefully, on the right-hand side, right by the trees there, you can see a man standing there. And if you look at the left center of the photograph, you can see a little hump there. That's one of the conical mounds that was in the woods at Hilgen Springs. I don't know who that man is. I suspect it might be Boehm himself, but we're not sure. Excuse me. This mound site was known as early as 1840. Next mound, slide, please. There were 3 mounds at Hilgen Springs. All of them were pitted into by relic hunters before 1968. And the initial excavations were published in Wisconsin Archaeologist in 1971 and in 1973 by Howard Van Langdon, who is the excavator, and Thomas Keyhole, who was an archaeologist supervising the excavations in 1968. Mounds 1 and 2 at Hilgen Springs are some of the earliest carbon-14 dated mounds in the upper Midwest, dated at 480 BC. And there were multiple burials that occurred in all 3 mounds. Next slide, please. We'll skip that slide for now. Next slide, please. This is a map that shows the location of Hilgen Springs on Cedar Creek. And you can see where the red arrow points to the bend in the river. And the green arrow points to the approximate location upslope of where the mounds were, where it says sewage disposal. Well, that's where the mound sites were at that time. The mounds were located about 300 feet above Cedar Creek, sloping downslope towards the creek. Next slide, please. This is that map I showed you earlier of Charles E. Brown was one of the founding fathers of the Wisconsin Archaeological Society and considered one of the state's first preeminent archaeologists. And he was responsible for the preservation of dozens of mound sites around the state of Wisconsin. And he was going all around the state and doing these maps of mound sites. So he comes to Cedarburg in 1907, and he meets with Dr. Leopold Drexel, who many of you in Cedarburg will know that name from Drexel's drugstore. And him and Dr. Drexel go out and they do this rudimentary map of the 3 conical mounds that were in Hilgen Spring. So that's the only known map of the site that was ever done. Next slide, please. The Hilgen Spring mound site in Mound 1 was 60 feet in diameter by 6 feet high. There were 3 bundle burials, all disturbed, but the size of the mound, because of the size of the mound, much of the mound was left undisturbed by relic hunters. Mound 2 was 35 feet by 4 feet high, 35 feet diameter, 4 feet high. It had contained an interesting child burial. And Mound 3 was 30 feet diameter, or 3.5 feet high. and at least 5 bundle burials were in this mound, but this mound was heavily disturbed even before the excavations in 1968. Next slide, please. Now, we're going to start getting into the actual excavation photographs now from 1968. These were all taken by Howard Van Langdon, and these were the ones that were preserved by his son Jay Van Langdon and given to us, given to me in the Milwaukee Public Museum. And this shows the bend in Cedar Creek in 1968, upslope from where the mound sites actually were. Next slide, please. This shows Cedar Creek and the forested hillside on the opposite embankment. This is early spring 1968. The excavations occurred in June of 1968. Next slide, please. This is what the woods looked like back then before the disturbance of the mound site area. Next slide. And this is the only known photograph of Mound 1 right before Howard Van Langdon began his excavation. And you can see there's a tree that was cut off the top there, and some of the debris was taken off this mound. Next slide, please. And back in 1949, Dwayne Bassett here, who was an avocational guy, he dug into Mound 1, wanting to know what was in Mound. And he, on April 27th of 1949, somebody took a photograph of him digging into Mound 1, which was the largest of the 3 mounds. And you can see here, right as he pitted into the side of that mound, he found human remains. Now, at this point, I wanted to make a disclaimer here, disclosure that I am going to be showing some human remains that are in situ in the archaeological excavation photographs. And I don't do this to be disrespectful to any Native Americans, but I think that this is a valuable educational tool that will show what was in these mounds. And I just want to make sure that everybody understands that we're not doing this to be disrespectful. It's just as a part of an educational tool to help us better understand. Next slide, please. If you look at this slide, it's a little blurry. Some of the pictures are a little blurry, but you can see the mound in the distance there, and there's a spoil pile of some dirt, and that's in the forefront there. And what Howard Van Langdon did was he only had about 2 weeks to excavate the mounds, so he was under time constraints. So what he decided to do was to trench right through the middle of the 2 mounds that he was able to excavate, with the expressed purpose of having a higher probability of encountering the burial features within the center of these mounds. So he starts to trench about a body width trench right down the middle by taking off the top sod and then digging right into the side of these mounds. Next slide, please. And right here, you can see how he's removed the topsoil and that he's starting to peel away layers of soil trenching through the middle of Mound 1 here. Next slide, please. This is the first photograph of a first trench cut where he's starting to excavate down on top of it now, looking for a burial feature. Now, the excavation techniques at this time, even in 1968, were a little bit crude compared to what we systematically do today in archaeological excavations. And just so everybody knows, we no longer excavate mound sites. It's a thing of the past. All the mound sites are protected now by the Burial Sites Protection Act. So we don't do this anymore, and just so you understand that. Next slide, please. Now, this is a profile of the conical burial mound as he's getting a little bit deeper into the mound, and he's excavating down into the center part of it. And you can see that in the middle part of the left-hand side there, he encountered his first, what looks to be a bundle burial inside the mound there. Next slide, please. Now, the artist rendition shows how Native Americans would have used basket load by basket load of dirt to construct these mounds on top of the burials. And it's kind of hard to see in this photograph, but if you know what you're looking at from studying the stratigraphy of archaeological excavations, you can actually see little basket loading of little piles of dirt as they were piled up in this photograph. It's kind of hard to see, but if you have a more trained eye like I do, you can see where there was basket loading in piles on top of this mound to construct it. Next slide, please. Right here, he encounters what he calls from his archaeological excavation notes his first black midden layer of real dark organic soil. And right below that area, you can see where there's a little thin line of reddish sand right there, which is a purposeful inclusion of soil into the construction of the mound. Next slide, please. Here's a shot looking into that trench, and he's using the axe that he had there as a prop to show the scale. He probably had the axe there to cut through tree roots that had grown in through the mound. And you can see where he's encountering on the left-hand side there his first rock, purposeful rock inclusion into the mound. And on the upper left-hand side there, he's already taken a couple of rocks out of the excavation trench. Next slide, please. Another excavation trench where he is encountering more rocks inclusions in the mound as he's trenching through. Mound 1. Next slide, please. And this is a close-up shot that where he describes how they're using a mottled mixture of ash, red ochre, dirt, fire-reddened sand and clay, and muck that was brought up from Cedar Creek, muck from the creek, marl from the creek beds, and just kind of hard-packed into the stratigraphy of the mound itself. Next slide, please. This shows where he's getting down closer into the excavation center excavation burial pit feature, but not quite down into the burial yet. Next slide, please. This is a picture. This is the only known picture of Howard Van Langdon at the actual mound site excavation with his two sons, Jay and Todd. And as I mentioned before, these boys were quite young at the time, and neither of them actually remembered a whole lot about the excavation, but they did remember being there and minor details of helping their father to excavate. And that's a photograph of Howard Van Langdon himself holding a Marion thick pot that was partially reconstructed. And like I mentioned before, these photographs were courtesy of Jay and Todd Van Langdon. Next slide, please. Now you can see here where he takes a step back, and you can see the mound here facing towards the creek, and how he's trenched through it, and then how he's starting to excavate off to the side here because he's hitting archaeological features that are off to the side. So he's expanding his excavation into the center, more off to the center of the mound itself. This gives you a little bit better idea of the scale of the excavation and the size of that mound. Next slide, please. So Mound 1 facts. Mound 1 was constructed on a cleared but not level subsurface, removal of the ground level topsoil. Central burial feature pit contained probably recognized 4 bundle burials. This central pit was covered with black soil min layer, which included camp debris, snail and mussel shells, deer bone, antler, teeth, charred bone fragments, work bone, flint flakes, cores of lithic material, potsherds, fire-cracked rock, and red ochre. It also contained 5 stone altars constructions, which were relatively oval in construction. The stones in the excavation seem to be chosen, according to Howard Van Langdon, because of their bright colors and their beauty. So he was the people that built the mound and included these rock stone altars in them, chose the stones carefully from the surrounding landscape. And from the excavation, he learned that the stone constructions were not fire bases inside the mound as part of any ritual activity. And unfortunately, he didn't have time to excavate beneath these stone altar constructions that you'll see in a minute here. And I think that if he had done that, from what we know of previous early woodland mound excavations, that he probably would have found cremation burials underneath those rock features. Also in Mound 1, there was a prehistoric dog burial that was placed above the black min layer, which was a purposeful dog burial. Next slide, please. This just shows a map, and it shows a stone rectangular structure that was placed on the mound floor, where they found some charcoal, where they got the radiocarbon date of 460 BC. Mound 1, at that time in 1968, was considered the oldest constructed conical burial mound in Wisconsin and in the upper Midwest. It shows the placement of other burials here through A1 through 3, or A1 through 5, and the location of the purposeful dog burial. Next slide, please. Now, right here, you see the boys sitting there, but you can see the central burial pit in where they found the bundle burials. And Howard Van Langdon did not, and I believe he did this on purpose out of respect, he did not take in situ photographs of the burials in those pits right there, but he did take photographs of these unique stone altar piles. And that's stone altar pile 1 there to the left center of the photograph. Next slide, please. Here's a black and white one where he expands the excavation to the right, and you can see the other stone pile that was to the right of the first one that you just saw. And altar 1 was made of mixed field stones and limestone. Next slide, please. And again, here's a black or a color photograph looking straight on of that same view of Mound 1, where you see the 2 stone altar piles, and then towards the back left, he encounters another one. And he's got it staked out where those were when he was plotting his map there. Next slide, please. Again, further expanding the excavation farther back all the way to the other side before it starts to go down slope. Next slide, please. Close up of the cleaned off stones in place. And as I mentioned, he did not excavate underneath those stone piles. And I suspect if he did, he would have encountered more burials underneath those piles. More than what has been recorded in the archaeological reports. Next slide, please. Another shot of the stone pile. Next slide. That is where he did pick through the piles a little bit, and you can see where he picked off some of the stones here. Next slide, please. This is a close-up shot of one of the brightly colored stones that were selected by the prehistoric people to make the stone altar. Next slide. Stone configuration of Mound 1, he called this altar A3, north side of the mound. And if you look up into the wall, you can see the differing layers of stratigraphy that are, and then in the corner center past the rock pile, you can see there's a burned feature there, possibly a cremation burial. Next slide. And then this was that unusual laid out rectangular or slightly rectangular stone pile where they found charred remains in it, including wood charred remains where they got their radiocarbon date from. Next slide. This is a close-up of that feature in plain view. Next slide, please. Now, diagnostic artifacts like projectile points were also found associated with early woodland pottery. This is the base of a projectile point of a Kramer, what we call a Kramer-style projectile point, which dates to 500 to 1000 BC, late Archaic through the early woodland period. This also helps us date the mound other than the radiocarbon dates. And this was found by Altar 4 and associated with Marian-thick pottery in the mound. Next slide, please. This projectile point, which we also refer to as a Henschel point, or also known as a Fox Valley stem point, also dates to the late Archaic, early woodland transition to 1000 to 500 BC. And this was found in the above of the stone altar near Mound Altar 4 in Mound 1. Next slide, please. This is a Preston, or what is also called a monono-stemmed point. And this was found in the midden layer near the northwest corner of Altar 4 in Mound 1. And this is made out of Indiana hornstone or chalcedony, which is a non-native lithic material that only comes from southern Indiana and parts of southern Illinois. So this is a lithic material that was traded up into Wisconsin in prehistoric times, which also helps us to date the cultural time frame of Mound 1. Next slide, please. Just shows the location of stone altar 5. And they found some human bones and some fragments and some snail shells, purposeful placed snail shells on the top of stones are roughly 3 inches below the mound surface in altar 5 here. Next slide, please. Altar 5, Mound 1, another shot of that altar in the mound. Next slide. Another stone altar mound. Next slide, please. This is some of the early woodland pottery shards from Mound 1 near Altar 5. This is not Marian-thick, but it is early woodland pottery, which is really thick and sand and crushed stone tempering. Next slide, please. This is actually a what we call a North Bay 1 rim shard that is also early woodland pottery that was found in 35 shards concentrated by Altar 5 of a crushed pot that was purposely placed in Mound 1. Next slide, please. And this is also the broken base of a Durst style point that dates to the early woodland, which was found in Mound 1, also by Stone Altar 5 in the Milwaukee Public Museum collection. That's actually made out of Hixton silicified sandstone, which is a lithic material that only occurs in Wisconsin, which is found by Silver Mound way up in the northwestern part of the state over by Black River Falls. So to find that in Cedarburg means that it was also another lithic stone material that was traded into the area. Next slide, please. These are some of the shells that were found probably in Cedar Creek that were incorporated into the mound fill. And these were interpreted by Howard Van Langen to be inclusions in the mound fill as possible offerings. Next slide, please. Now, this is a scattered in situ bone bundle that was disturbed in a pitting into the mound at some time prior to the excavation. And you can see the human remains have been scattered a little bit. And when Van Langdon excavated down, this is how he encountered them in the mound fill at that time. This is one of the few photographs that he took of human remains. And like I said, I think he did that on purpose, that he didn't take a lot of photographs out of respect for the old ones and the Native Americans. Next slide, please. Stone altar 2. Let's go to the next slide. Another shot of stone altar 2. Next slide, please. Another projectile point that dates to the same time period we're talking about, found in Mound 1. Preston notch made out of local heat-treated lithic material. Next slide, please. Other shell material found with burial 1 in Mound 1. Snail and clam shells were mixed with fire blackened soil and red ochre and tightly packed around the bundle burials 1, 2, and 3 in Mound 1. Next slide, please. This is the canine or dog burial. And if you look at the right side bundling, you can see the skull of the dog. And you can see how the bones in that dog burial are kind of a reddish hue. Well, that's because they were covered with ochre, with red ochre, and then buried in the mound as an intrusive burial at some point after the mound was fully constructed. But somebody in prehistoric times loved that dog, and they wanted to make sure that it had a proper burial. Next slide, please. This is that same dog skull and the lower mandible of the dog. And we learned by studying the mandible that the dentation of the second and third permanent molars had not erupted through the mandible, which means that this dog, when it died, was less than a year old. So it was a puppy, and it was quite small. And it's quite fascinating to me because, I wonder what the heck did this dog look like, right? But it was found 2.5 feet below the surface in the yellow sand fill, which is a purposeful yellow sand fill in the stratigraphy of the mound. So this was not placed in there by accident or by natural causes. It was placed in there by somebody in prehistoric times. Next slide, please. These are some of the other bones recovered from the dog burial, which includes, this is a photograph taken by Howard Van Langen. The previous slide was taken by me when examining the bones in the collection. Next slide, please. Woodland, in Middle Woodland times, dating between 200 BC to about 400 BC, dog ceremonialism was actually quite common in Illinois. It was well documented as being inclusive burials in burial mounds. So this is a continuation into the Middle Woodland as well. Next slide, please. This is a chert biface knife that was also found in Mound 1. Next slide, please. These are some of the juvenile white-lipped flame tiger snails shells that were purposefully placed in the burial matrix of Mound 1. And these were identified by their species by Dr. Jim Thieler of the University of Wisconsin La Crosse, where he was one of my mentors as an undergraduate archaeology student. And Jim Thieler is an expert in these types of snail shells and other types of shells in North America. So he identified these for me as being these types of flame tiger snails, which are common in a lot of creeks around southeastern Wisconsin. Next slide, please. These are 8 land snails, flame tiger snails, shells that were also found with this red sandstone piece, this red ochre piece, which was found in burial 1 in Mound 1 of Hilgen Springs. Next slide, please. These are some lithic, purposefully made lithic thumb scrapers that were found in the mound as possible grave inclusions into the mound itself. Next slide, please. These are lithic flakes of different types of lithic material that were more than likely scraped up in camp debris and included as part of the mound fill. Next slide, please. These are lithic chert pieces that were also included in the mound fill, debitage from flint knapping in the mound fill. Next slide, please. This is a lithic core of hornstone that was found in the midden layer. The midden layer is what we refer to as the burial layer. And you can see there's a big piece bashed out of the stone of the outer cortex where you can see the inner hornstone piece, which is the good stuff inside that they want to use to make stone tools with. Next slide, please. This shows the Dousman mound again, or other outer burials of different mound, very similar to what we just looked at as rock altar piles from a mound in southwestern Wisconsin from that Bureau of Ethnology report. Next slide, please. So Dr. Hall, Robert Hall, many of you know him from his famous book, Archaeology of the Soul. I was fortunate to know Dr. Hall. Dr. Hall was a professor and archaeologist emeritus at the University of Chicago and adjunct curator of anthropology at the Field Museum. And I knew him in his latter half of his life, when he would come into the Milwaukee Public Museum and come to UW Milwaukee on occasion to meet with students and talk with them about their archaeology projects. And he has, Dr. Hall explored aspects of mound symbolism and surmised that the dramatic period of mound construction could not have come and gone over a 2,500 year period without leaving clues in the surviving Native American traditions that archaeologists can use to reconstruct ancient ideologies. So when Dr. Hall wrote his famous book, The Archaeology of the Soul, he describes some of the things that we're seeing in these mound site excavations, and he tries to apply them to this deep time perspective and what these rock piles and what the symbolism behind these things might have meant to the Native Americans of the past that constructed them. Next slide, please. And for woodland mound period builders, the most important aspect of mound building may have been to associate through the ritual of death of a prominent person with the rebirth and renewal of the world. The concept was clearly present at the first mounds being built in Wisconsin. And at Hilgen Spring Mound 1, Robert Hall has called the attention to the 5 rock altars that we just looked at as possible metaphors in the widespread earth diver origin stories and rituals of recreation of the earth by water creatures, by a water creature that dives down, if you will, to retrieve the primordial muck from which the earth is made of. So in a sense, constructing a conical burial mound is a ritual recreation of recreating the earth itself by piling up these primordial layerings of muck and marl and ochre and all these things that come from the natural environment. And he also identified the concentrations of these things as having a possible 4 cardinal directions emphasis inside the mound as well. And we know rock concentrations at roughly the cardinal directions to this earth and creation myth that in Winnebago myth in particular, they have a myth of using of having earth weights to describe how they settled the earth. And these might be representations of the Winnebago earth myth of using these concentrations of rocks as earth weights. Next slide, please. And this stone, the 5 stone altars or 5 clumps of muck inside the mounds were also possibly interpreted as a toe pattern of an earth diver. And an earth diver could be like an otter or a dive. In some Native American traditions, it's referred to as a diving duck, like a loon or something like that. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're getting into mound side. Mound 2. Mound 2 was the middle mound of the 3. It had a yellow subfloor soil, which is used as the mound floor. And central subsurface burial pit contained 1 extended in-the-flesh burial, and there were no photographs taken of this burial. In this mound, there was a newborn infant burial at the northern edge of the black midden soil mound, midden soil covering the central section of the mound. Red ochre pebbles were placed at the left hand of this infant burial. Within the western edge of the black and midden area was a central pile of white ash on top of a layer of red ochre. Van Langen described this area as a cremation pit, which contained numerous charred bone fragments and few flint flakes. There were 7-inch layer of dark humus on top of the observed surrounding mound midden layer. And the oval hearth layer was 2 feet by 1.5 feet, composed of a layer of thick blackened and fire-cracked stone. Next slide, please. This shows that oval hearth feature as he was just excavating down into it. Next slide, please. This was an interesting lower leg and feet bones, which were purposefully placed in the midden layer in a central area of the excavation, and there wasn't any other part of the body with it, just 2 lower legs. And why that occurred, we're not exactly sure. Next slide, please. This is the trenching cut of Mound 2. He did the exact same trenching technique as Mound 1. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Again, trenching through Mound 2 on the opposite side. Next slide, please. Showing some of the stratigraphy of Mound 2. And if you'll notice at the bottom middle part, you can see some bone material there. Well, that's where he encountered some profile of the inner wall trench excavation with some bone material coming up in that dark layer in the central part of that photograph. Next picture, please. You can see the stratigraphy of the profile wall, the dark midden or a humus layer on the top, and then a dark layer at the bottom there where it gets really dark. Next slide, please. This slide shows the intrusive central bundle burial, which was probably placed in this mound in late Woodland times based on the pottery shard that was incorporated with those human remains. So this was an intrusive bundle burial that probably was placed in the mound anywhere up to 1,000 years, possibly after this mound was constructed. Next slide, please. And there was a charcoal sample from Mound 1 in feature 6 on the right-hand side here that was radiocarbon dated to 525 BC. Or 525, 526 BC from feature 6 in Mound 1. So again, even though we have 3 mounds at Hilgen Springs, that doesn't mean that all 3 of these mounds were built during the same mound building episode. One of them could have been built 100 years later. Sample 2 from Mound 2, feature 5, a fire hearth of limestone on the cleared mound floor dated to 840 BC in that particular section. So you got a pretty good chunk of time there between Mound 1 and Mound 2. Next slide, please. This one shows the intrusive burial again. And right below, you can see where it says white ash remains. You see a thin layer of white ash down there. And that is a more than likely a lower extended cremation burial. Next slide, please. This shows the mound profile from 1971. It shows the black min layer capped off, dug down deep, down through a purposeful layer of yellow subsoil, red subsoil on top of a gravel layer. The burial pit contained lower limbs like of that photograph I showed you, and then an extended fully human burial, which he did not take a photograph of. Next slide, please. This is a close-up photo of the intrusive bundle burial. Next slide, please. This shows the bundle burial again. And then if you look down below, as you go down, you see the different layers of stratigraphy. And at the very bottom of the photograph, you see that dark reddish layer. That is a layer of ochre that is not only on top of a cremation, but also an ash layer on top of the red ochre. Next layer, please, or next slide, please. Again, here you can see those stratigraphy layers. You have the intrusive late woodland bundle on top, down through the yellow sandy sublayer, into the midden layer, white ash layer cremation concentration with mixed red ochre and red sandy soil. All purposeful layers. Next slide. Again, a close-up of that. Again, 1 foot below the surface, then the sandy red layer. And you see where it says cap of dark organic soil. You can see how that kind of peaks up or mounds up there. Well, that was the dark cap of the really hard pack of organic mixture of soil that they packed really hard right on top of the burial feature. Next slide, please. Another stratigraphy angle of that same burial feature. Next slide, please. Close-up of the intrusive burial again, and you can see there's a small pottery rim shard that is more than likely late woodland in nature. Next slide, please. This is that pottery shard. It's grit and sand tempered, very thin walled, and it has inner bossed impressions, and it was termed Hilgen Springware, but it's actually the lip of some type of a small seed jar or something that was purposefully placed with the intrusive bundle burial. Next slide. Again, shows the location of the pottery in conjunction with the intrusive burial. Next slide. Here is a human mandible and radius arm bone. And again, you can see how it is reddish in nature. That's because these bones were stained with red ochre. Next slide, please. These are pieces of sandstone and red ochre. These are the artifacts that were associated with the infant burial in Mound 2. Next slide, please. This is the another piece of red ochre, which was found in the mound fill. Excuse me. Coincidentally, the Greek word for ochre means blood. So this artifact was also found near the fingers of the left hand of the infant burial. Next slide, please. This is woodland pottery of crushed rock temper, smoothed over finish, thick grit sand temper found in Mound 2. Next slide, please. This is a gorget, not a gorget. It's pronounced gorget. This is a ceremonial piece that is a drilled green chlorite schist. And they would make these in these rectangular shapes and drill holes through them. And it's also stained with ochre on it. And this artifact was broken, and sometimes they ritually killed artifacts as part of including artifacts in the fill of the burial of the person that owned this particular artifact that may have been buried in the mound. So it's like a way of breaking the artifact to ritually release it, so to speak. And you see this in other mound site burials. Next slide, please. This is what a gorget looks like when it's in its entirety. And this one was found in Thingsville, just up the road from Cedarburg, in a red ochre site burial that was excavated in the 1950s. Next slide, please. These are some mound. These are some biface, leaf-shaped bifaces found in Mound 2 and in Mound 1 in the mid layer of different types of lithic material, which were common in early woodland and middle woodland burials. Next slide, please. These are some of what these leaf burial, red ochre burial leaf-shaped bifaces look like. Next slide, please. And these are broken tips of more than likely large chert biface blades that were included in the mound mid layer of Burlington chert, which is also not found in Wisconsin, but imported into the area from southeastern Iowa and west central Illinois. These chert tip blades resemble ones that were found in other red ochre sites. Next slide, please. Some more white-lipped globe snail shells in Mound 2, identified by Dr. Thaler. Next slide, please. This is a really interesting piece of pottery that was found in Mound 2, and this has been identified at the Henschel Mound site in Sheboygan, where it's we call it Henschel pottery, which is smoothed over, cord marked. You can see the cord impressions in the pottery. It's a common pottery style type of the early woodland period, and the interior exhibited remains of charred food remains in them. And the rope cord markings are a Z-twist pattern on them. So this has been seen in other early woodland mounds that help us to date this mound to that period. Next slide, please. These are the examples of the Marion thick pottery that date to 500 BC, taken out of Mound 2. And again, this top pottery type is diagnostic of early woodland, but it's actually fairly rare in southeastern Wisconsin, or it hasn't been identified in a lot of sites. Next slide, please. This is a close-up of the cross-section of a piece of Marion thick with the sand and grit tempering. Next slide, please. Inner smoothing of the pottery shard from Hilgen Springs. Next slide, please. So not much is known about Mound 3. Mound 3 was heavily disturbed and pitted into way before 1968. But a local informer from Cedarburg told Charles Brown in 1906 that he had recovered a stone axe and what he described as 21 skeletons from Mound 3. Where those artifacts and human remains went, nobody knows. This was never verified or documented. What mound this came from is still in question, but most likely Mound 3. And Mound 3 was not excavated by Van Langdon because of time constraints of building the water treatment plant. Next slide, please. This is another piece of Marion thick pottery that was found in Mound 3 in the debris from the bulldozer that leveled the mound. Next slide, please. These are some more chert flakes from Mound 3 found in the fill that was plowed over. Next slide, please. Now, future research on Hilgen Spring could identify lithic materials, because this is a pile of all different types of lithic material that was found in the mid layer from all three mounds. So if somebody wanted to sit down and try to identify the different types of lithic materials and where they're found on the geological landscape, that might tell us a little bit about where the movement of people and these lithic materials from around the area. Next slide, please. Now, in conclusion, and I'm sorry this was a very long presentation, but it was a lot of information. But just to summarize, from these excavation photographs, which are evidence in of themselves, and the radiocarbon dates of 480 plus BC, this dates the Hilgen Spring Mound site as one of the oldest, if not the oldest, conical burial mound sites in all of Wisconsin, and certainly of all of the upper Midwest. And the reason that these excavation photographs were so vitally important is that being able to see those excavation photographs in color and the stratigraphy reinforces the belief that these mounds were as old as we thought that they were. And in 1968, when those excavation C14 dates came back, a lot of the archaeologists back in the day were kind of doubting the validity of those radiocarbon dates, and having these photographs helps us to validate that in fact those radiocarbon dates were in fact accurate, and that this was one of the earliest conical sites in the state. This photograph is a photograph of me standing at the Kingsley Bend Mound site between Portage and the Dells, and this is on a terrace above the Wisconsin River in a prototypical setting right above the Wisconsin River on a big bend in the river. And if you ever visit this site, oftentimes what was happening is effigy mound builders, the people in the late Woodland that were building mounds in the shape of effigy mounds, which is a whole nother lecture, they were going back to sites that were even ancient to them by 1,000 years and building effigy mounds in and amongst the conical burial mounds from the early and middle Woodland time period. And this is what you see at the Kingsley Bend site. And this is me just standing in front of the mound that's preserved. This site is owned by the Ho-Chunk Nation and is protected and overseen by people like Bill Quackenbush, who is the tribal historic preservation officer of the Ho-Chunk Nation. And so I just want to end by saying these mound sites, even though we have nearly 10,000 mounds that are still remaining in the state of Wisconsin, that number, believe it or not, is not very large, especially when it comes to early woodland conical mound sites and the remaining 3,200, give or take, effigy mounds that still remain out of about 25,000 mounds that once existed. So these are irreplaceable cultural resources that are just as important as Stonehenge or the Great Pyramids in the Giza Plateau, and they deserve every bit of our respect and preservation. And I thank you all for being very patient in this long presentation, and I hope you learned something. And if anybody has any questions, I will be more than happy to stay online as long as possible to answer all those questions. And I hope that we can do this again. Thank you.
All right.
And thanks to Joe from the Cedarburg History Center for setting this up and giving me the opportunity to explain the significance of that site. And
yeah, thank you very much, Kurt. Very, very, very interesting that I found it. And I have a few questions if nobody else does. I know you answered quite a lot as you went through, but I thank you for telling us that we no longer excavate these mounds, but it seems that we can learn something from what the excavation was done, and
absolutely,
you hint at some of that, the religion, Um, what I found interesting is maybe the trading that was done, or the traveling of the different people. I guess, what do we know, like what maybe the later on groups did? Because obviously these are not the same, descendants that became, like you had mentioned, the Ho Chunk or the Winnebago. I mean, these were peoples before those moved into the area.
Well, in some cases, yes. One way that I like to frame that one, oftentimes people ask me, well, who built these mounds? What tribe built the mounds, right? And a better way to think about it is to frame it this way: is that during the nearly probable 15,000 years, 13,000 years for sure of human occupation of Wisconsin, since the last ice age, there were many, many different groups of prehistoric indigenous people that called Wisconsin home. And when we get into the late Archaic and into the early Woodland period, right around 1000 BC, you have many different groups of people on the landscape that begin to practice burial ritualism in the form of mound construction.
Sure.
Algonquin-speaking people, Siouan-speaking people, they all did it at one time or another. A lot of the indigenous tribes to Wisconsin, some of them do claim to, at one point in the past, to have had a connection to mound building, and others have claimed that they didn't. And so I can't tell you exactly who the folks were 2,500 years ago that built the mounds in Cedarburg, but I can tell you they were indigenous Native American peoples, and that they started a nearly 1900-year history of mound construction that endured for many generations of different types of people adopting the burial ritualism and expressing it in slightly different ways. So that, I guess, that's maybe a better way to
Sure.
frame it.
Yeah. Very good. Thanks. I know it's a question others have asked of me. And now it looks like we do have a few questions here. I'll just address Kitty Hill. Yes, the entire recording will be available on both the Facebooks and YouTube as soon as this concludes. It'll just take a few minutes and then you can restart it. Sorry that you couldn't find it. I know, technology can be a great thing when it works, and sometimes it's a little iffy on how we've kind of shown it and everything. But that's why we chose to do this method, so that it will be available for viewing later on. Beth has a pretty interesting question there. What were those I guess the gadgets, is the guy spelled there right? The little
Gorget.
yeah,
Yeah,
with the holes
I'll go
drilled
back.
there.
Yeah, well, gorgets are typically made. They start occurring in the archaeological record in the Archaic period, Middle Archaic, Late Archaic, and more than likely earlier than that. But quite frankly, we're not entirely sure what they were used for. They're rectangular object that can be quite thin because they're shaped out of a sedimentary schist. I'm not saying a bad word. A schist type of a green chlorite schist type of rock, and they're shaped and they're polished, and they typically have two drill holes through them that make them almost look like sandal soles. And the idea was that these were some type of decorative thing that they wore around their neck that was suspended as a necklace piece that more than likely showed that person had some type of a social status. And they're often found almost entirely in mortuary context in burials, in mounds or in non-mound burials in the red ochre period before mound construction. So they had some type of social significance. They were viewed more than likely as some type of a social marker for the person who wore it. And how they exactly suspended it, we don't really know. People have theorized about it, but we don't really know. And then that's the best answer I can give you.
Okay.
But they're found in mortuary context, and they were deemed as something that was valuable.
All right, wonderful. Great question. Great question. Yeah, very interesting. Scott has a few questions up there. What accounts for the different types of the burials? You know, there's seated ones, laying down. Does that kind of mean anything, I guess, or a hierarchy?
Well,
Or
yeah, if you study the entirety of the Woodland tradition from early Woodland through the effigy mound building, the different types of burials did seem to have some type of social status attached to them. For instance, like when we talk about these early Woodland conical burials, you tend to find a lot of extended burials where people are placed on their back in the flesh. And then in some cases, but you don't see that in effigy mound construction 1,000 years later. It's very unusual. So, and one thing to remember too is that not everybody was being buried in mounds. Only people that were deemed to have some type of social importance or social status within the group were being buried in mounds. And more than likely, well, quite frankly, we don't know what they were doing with the rest of the people that weren't buried in mounds. More than likely, they were either being buried in shallow graves that have deteriorated or been plowed over, or they were cremated, and that doesn't show up in the archaeological record very well, especially if it's not in the mound context. But oftentimes, there have been documented cases, especially through the Bureau of Ethnology excavations in the 1880s and 90s, where they found people in the seated position, where people were facing towards the east or towards the south or towards the west. And that obviously had something to do with some type of significance.
Sure.
And they really didn't differentiate a lot in these mounds between men, women, or children being buried in the mounds. And one of the things that we didn't talk about in the presentation was we did look at the osteology of these mounds. And the oldest person in the Hilgen Springs mound site was a woman that they estimated was about 45 years old. Other than that, everybody else that was buried in these mounds was in their late 20s or in some cases even younger. So a lot of these people back then didn't have a real longevity of life. And when I started examining the bones, and I had help from a friend, a woman named Sarah, that is an archaeologist, Sarah Smith, who was studying physical anthropology and was also working with us at the Milwaukee Public Museum. She got permission from Don Scherdemay to examine the human remains with me. And I was expecting to see a lot of malnutrition in the bones of the people that were buried in these mounds. And we knew that by and large, that the people weren't going to have great age, but we expected to see a lot of malnutrition. And in fact, we didn't see that at all. And we actually found that these people, for the most part, were fairly healthy, and there wasn't a lot of physical trauma that was evident in the bone. I think we had one individual that had a broken leg that you could see was that had mended, where you could see where the
back up, sure.
Yeah. And then we did see a little bit of in a couple of the human skulls that were excavated, there was some pitting of the bone in a few skulls that is indicative of of some form of infection that had taken place in the jaws, in particular, where they had bad teeth. Because one of the things that's really interesting is that most of these human remains had these people had perfectly straight teeth, and this is at least 1,000 years before the advent of corn horticulture was brought into Wisconsin by the Mississippian people that are at Aztalan. So you don't see a lot of you don't see dental carriers or cavities in these people because there wasn't a large amount of starch in their diet from corn and the sweetness of corn. And but when you get into middle woodland construction of those really big conical mounds, which is really a carryover from the Adena-Hopewell culture of the Ohio River Valley. In the Ohio River Valley, you have the advent of the Adena-Hopewell culture, and they're the ones that are building the really giant earthen conical mounds where they're going back over successive generations, like the Nichols Mound that we showed early on in the presentation. And in those mounds, they're burying people mostly in the extended position or in the seated position, and they're including a lot of grave goods, big obsidian blades, bear teeth, bear claws, Gulf shells from the Gulf Coast, copper from the Great Lakes, sheet mica from the eastern coast. And that whole mound building complex in the middle woodland was entirely the culture was built upon massive trade networks across the mid-continent. So when they excavated these mounds in the Ohio River Valley, that's where you find like all these beautiful, like carved soapstone animal pipes, like platform pipes and exotic grave goods of all these different things that we mentioned. And then, when we get into late woodland times, we don't really know exactly what the impetus for them building effigy mounds was, except to say that it probably had something to do with the beginnings of clan ceremonialism and clan identification, and some type of perceived threat to the people's cultural identity. So somebody got the idea, well, we can shape mounds like conical and linear embankments. If we can do that, we can make them look like birds and bears and some of these other things that you see with effigy mounds. And in effigy mounds, you primarily have singular burials for the most part that are placed in the heart region of the effigy, but not always. Sometimes there are multiple burials, and oftentimes there are cremations and bundle burials. Okay, and what bundle burials tell us is that there was more than likely some type of ancestor worship that was going on, where the people that were buried were put on a scaffolding or put in what's called a charnel house, which is a platformed house that has a roof over the top of it, and the bones were able to decay, and the people were bundling these bones up into bundles, and then keeping them for a period of time, and then transporting them to mound sites to bury them later. And in archaic times, we know that they had these large, what they call ossuary pits, where they were taking these bundle burials and placing them in these ossuary pits, burying them up, and then over a period of many years, they would redig them up, take these bundles out of these pits, place them on the scaffolding, and have some feasting. And this was actually documented in by the Black Robe Jesuit priests in the 1600s when they come into the Upper Great Lakes and they come in contact with the Huron, who are still doing what they call their Feast of the Dead, where they're taking these bundle burials out of these ossuary pits for a period of time and honoring these ancestors by and then reburying them again. And Nitschke Mounds in Dodge County is a good example of that, where you have these multiple burials in effigy mounds that is not normally the norm, where you see a lot of bundle burials that did not originate in those mounds and that were buried in those mounds at a later date. And for whatever reason, in late woodland times, they primarily get away from those extended in the flesh burials. And but like I mentioned before, not everybody is being buried in these mounds. So in the archaeological record, we haven't really identified what they were necessarily doing with a lot of these other people that weren't being buried in mounds. But it's not showing up in the archaeological record in any great degree where it's been preserved or where we recognize it. So,
Sure.
And the mound excavations were, were a really unfortunate part of the past. They really were. And there's no hiding the fact that archaeology as a discipline has to atone for the fact that we did excavate mounds in the past, and it hasn't been done since the late 60s in most cases, and quite frankly, we had 170 plus years of mound site excavations of all these different cultural periods of mound construction. We know what are in these mounds. We can tell primarily what the mound periods are based on their size and shape, where they're located. We don't need to excavate mounds anymore. And, mound site excavations were being done as part of a leisurely past where people would literally put on their Sunday best in the 1920s and 30s and drive out someplace to a mound site and dig into a mound looking for relics. Well, one of the reasons people stop digging in effigy mounds is because they found out really quickly that effigy mounds didn't contain any type of burial goods. And that's another thing that happens in the burial ritualism in the late woodland period. They get away from placing burial goods in most cases in effigy mounds. You might find an occasional pot or maybe a projectile points, but nothing like the elaborate stuff that you're finding in middle woodland times, or in some cases in some documented early woodland mound construction. But we really don't know a whole heck of a lot about the early woodland period. We really don't. And unfortunately, so many of the sites have been destroyed that we lost so much information. And you have that deep time perspective, Are there other questions?
Well, I think Scott just kind of had a second follow-up. You might have asked some of that. How do archaeologists explain the appearance of the first woodland people cemeteries? And I think you touched on that a little bit in the discussion too.
Well, the first cemeteries that really show up in the archaeological record are these ones that occur. I mean, we do have examples of Paleo-Indian burials that are very rare because of the massive deep time difference.
Sure.
But there are burials that have been documented that are showing up in the Archaic period, but they're not humanly constructed mounds. And there is a culture that occurs in parts of Michigan and in northern Indiana and parts of Ohio that they call glacial came culture, where they're in the Archaic period, they're burying people on top of glacial cames, hills that are like shallow graves, like you saw in those Ochre burials, and they're doing that for a long period of time. But in Wisconsin, that cultural period or that manifestation is not really well known or recognized in the state because there just hasn't been a lot of excavations on top of glacial occurring knolls like cames and things where it's just been identified. And because of the types of soil and erosion and things that occur in Wisconsin, they just don't preserve that well in most cases, And the mounds preserve well, obviously, because they're mounded up and, you can see them and stuff. But but even then, when you look at some of these mounds, you can tell that there's been a degree of erosion on them as well. So,
Sure. Well, I mean, you have those pictures. There's trees growing on them, and that can be helpful.
Yeah, and that's why when we do the mound site care with the Effigy Mounds Initiative, the first thing that we do is we take all the woody vegetation, trees or buckthorn or whatever it is, right off the top of those mounds, because not only do those root systems invade burials in the mounds that disrupt them, but eventually a tree's going to get big, it's going to fall, it's going to uproot the side of a mound and
soil.
Sure. And we do know from that in prehistoric times, people were going to these mound sites and maintaining them. They weren't just making these mounds and letting them go to pot. They were doing controlled burns and burning the prairies and not only for hunting but for maintaining the cultural landscape. And so they were going back to these sites over many successive generations and caring for the sites as well.
All right. Yeah, I think that's most everybody's questions. So
well, I appreciate it.
Later on, you can ask them in the Facebook and or on the message boards, and we'll see if Kurt can get back and answer some of those.
Yeah, anybody that wants to ask me any questions through private message on Facebook or through the Effigy Mounds Initiative, by all means, just contact me on there or put your messages or your questions down. I'll be more than happy to ask or answer them. And I appreciate everybody that chimed in tonight and listened. And again, I'm sorry it was a long presentation, but these are complicated matters.
Sure. But now we have it recorded. We can go back and watch some of it later on. So,
that's right.
See the parts again, listen to that and get that detail again. So yeah, I really greatly appreciate it. It's something that I very much interests me when I just started out here in Cedarburg. So
yeah, it's amazing that to think that 2,500 years ago, people were in Cedarburg, Wisconsin, making mounds, and they sat there for all those years, and now unfortunately they're gone.
I believe you told me you're maybe writing a book on this.
I am writing a book. I just finished my my general mounds book that is at the University of Wisconsin Press right now for review. That book is titled "The Indian Mounds of the Horicon Marsh and the Upper Rock River," and I co-authored that book with Bill Volkert, who is retired now, but he used to run the Horicon National Wildlife Refuge in Horicon. But I am putting the Hilgen Springs mound site into a book that I'm actually working on right as we speak. And I don't know exactly when that's going to be done. I'm still kind of in the research collection phase of that at this point, but I'm hoping by sometime in 2023 that it'll be done and out for publication. So,
okay,
more to come.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay, and Beth, yes, I will be sharing this on Facebook page. I'll probably put it on the website, my next newsletter, all that kind of thing. So try to get this shared out as much as we can afterwards. So thank you, everybody, for your patience, and you have a good night.
Thank you.